I'm frozen with a solid glass spine. All it takes is a whack across my back. I'll be your jellyfish forevermore. Prince consorts line the room. Here I come, the fool. I'll twist and sing, wallow and play in my own shit. You only need watch it. Well, hello to you both. Welcome to New Musical Chairs, the post-punk podcast. Grab a drink and settle in. I'm Jay Cridford. Absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is essentially your own. That's a quote by martial arts icon Bruce Lee, and one that's rather apt for this episode. Today's guest is both a great advocate of that message and admirer of its messenger. Ausgang came writhing out of a tough Birmingham punk scene and into what would become goth by way of the post-punk fallout. They rejected power chord convention in favour of spasmodic, spontaneous shifts in mood and tempo. Listening to Ausgang is a bit like trying to dance in platforms on top of a rock pile, to be honest with you. These were murder ballads with a wry smile, witty, character-driven things that never let you forget that rock and roll was entertainment, first and foremost. Mark Freeth leads a punk lifestyle in the truest sense of the word, rejecting all convention. He's in his 60s, still trains every day, launching himself with abandon into fitness, art, music, and anything else he sets his mind to. Coming to us live from a single-decker bus in the middle of the woods, and a big advocate of this podcast, so, that's awesome. Mark, nice to hear from you again. I understand you've just listened to episode 1, actually.
I really enjoyed that interview you did for. Has that been broadcast yet? It hasn't gone out yet, has it?
It's going out on Monday.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's going out on Monday.
Yeah, it's a great interview. Really, really cool.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was because you were actually the first person I contacted when I kicked this project off, and then Bob actually got in touch and kind of said, "Oh, I can do tomorrow," or whatever it was. So, it just sort of ended up that way, really. But he was a really inspiring guy. Fantastic conversation. And I think Blood and Roses get left out of the conversation a lot when it comes to this era. And I think that's a bit unfair, really. But really great way to start things off.
Absolutely. And while I was listening to it, there were a number of parallels. I thought, that happened to me, or something similar happened to me. The time period you guys were talking about, and also I gathered we're a similar age. So it was really interesting, very interesting chat.
Thank you, because like I say, you were the first person I reached out to about this when I had it was a dumb idea I had probably 6 months ago now, something like that. I didn't know if it was ever going to take off, really, and I kind of thought, no, I've got to do this, so I just started contacting people, really. I thought
Sure.
It's an interesting way to tell the story of this period in a bit more detail than you can really do in a book or article or what have you. And I love talking to people, and it's interesting you mentioned the parallels, actually, because one thing I did want to ask you later on was Birmingham, the difference between, say, Birmingham and London, for example, around this time, because cities like London, Manchester, Leeds to a lesser extent, I feel, they've been over-explained, London has been over-explained. And so I feel like to have somebody like you from Birmingham, I think is going to put a new spin on that. We're going to jump around here. I want to talk to you about the US tour that you've just done, because it looked really well attended and really exciting. Tell me about it. Yeah,
very much so. In fact, we've had a number of conversations along these lines. We feel very, very humbled. We feel that it's just amazing that people still feel that we've got something to offer, given that there are so many talented young bands, I mean, right across the board, but especially in this scene. And, you know, like self, you know, I'm a big fan of music. I'm always listening to new music. I'm always researching, and I'm in touch with a number of young bands who I just think are astonishing. So the fact that we're considered relevant, that we've still got something to offer alongside these guys, is just brilliant. And the scene, this is why we tend to play abroad more than we play here. The scene abroad, whether it's Europe or the States, is just brilliant. It's really healthy, very, very well attended, and we're well looked after.
I hate to say it, but they really seem to know how to put on a festival over there. And they've really come into their own in the last few years. I mean, you look at something like Darker Days on Huntington Beach in California. You've got legacy acts like the Bunnymen, Chameleons, Skeletal Family, mingling with newer bands like Twin Tribes, Mulchat Doma. It's headlined by Tears for Fears. You've got Murder of Crows in New York. They just seem to know how to get the tone right. You know, a great mix of sounds. Yeah. Generations,
absolutely,
seemingly crossing generations of bands without prejudice, and everybody just gets into it.
I agree. Yeah, I can't actually put my finger on why it's hard.
That was my next question.
Right, I'm trying to read your mind here and then jump ahead. But honestly, yeah, I mean, you've obviously thought about this yourself. Why is it so hard here? You know, we did a warm-up show in London before we went across and did a show in Leipzig, and it was good. It was a good show. You know, the Water Rats had not played there before. It was, you know,
great venue.
It really is. I didn't even know it existed, and yet it's been around for so long.
Yeah, it has.
And you know, there were half decent amount of people there, new and old fans, but there wasn't that much in the way of action in terms of interaction with the audience. When we played Manchester just before we went to the States, you know, we enjoyed ourselves on the whole, but it wasn't well attended. There wasn't that interaction again, and yet when we got to Leipzig, when we got to LA, it just exploded, you know. And we've had the same reactions in all the places that we played since we reformed. All the places that we played abroad, been packed houses, and just you know, kids have really gone for it. And I'm not sure why that's not happening here. And I feel a bit bad when people. I was just answering an email actually about whether we'd like to come up to play for the first time in decades in Newcastle upon Tyne, and you know, I've got to be careful that I don't want to say no way, no, absolutely no way, you know, because I'd like to, but we've got to make sure that it's worth our while, and we don't end up, you know, walking in there, it's an empty hall. I don't know. I really don't know the answer. Yeah.
Nor do I. It's something I think about quite a lot, actually, and I've kind of mulled this over for a long time, you know, why generations of bands and fans don't come together with post-punk in the way that they do in other genres, such as metal, for example, particularly over here. I don't know what it is or why it is. You know, this was something I wanted to talk to you about later, and I talked to Bob about this thing of there's a degree of cynicism, perhaps, from certain generations with things like TikTok, YouTube reaction videos as well, that there's a degree of superficiality there, which I don't disagree with, but I kind of think any way younger generation can discover new music,
absolutely,
that's fantastic.
Yeah. I've met a couple of guys who are in this awesome band in Brighton. They're called Electric Cowboy Club. They are brilliant, and the singer and the bass player came to our London show, and they looked fantastic. It looked like they were in a band, you know, but they're so young. I mean, they're like maybe 19, 20, and yet the knowledge that they've got about music in general, and especially this scene, you know, they're big fans of ours, and that's why they were there.
Yeah.
And they know they tick all the right boxes in terms of name checking, the gun club and birthday party, this, that, and the other. Yeah. And yet they're so young. But of course, you know, all of this information is at our fingertips, and it makes me realize how different it was pre-internet. But it didn't matter because we still found out what we needed to find out. But how quickly kids are becoming sophisticated about music because of the internet. And as you say, so be it.
So we've kind of landed here, so we may as well delve in now rather than later, because I'm 33, so I got into post-punk, goth. I've said this. I think I've said this on both previous episodes, through MySpace, which was kind of the original. I got into a lot of these bands through my dad because he was there in London at the time. Went to a lot of these gigs, but my own sort of sense of discovery came through MySpace, which was kind of the original social media platform that actually allowed artists to have songs on their pages. And so, in a funny kind of way, it was almost like a hybrid of Bandcamp and Facebook.
Sure.
Less sophisticated than either, but it brought those two worlds together, and it kind of bridged the gap between the fan and the band. So we should talk about this, because I'm holding here Last Exit, which was the Ausgang compilation that came out through Cherry Red in 2000 hang on, let me look, 2001. I can't believe that. I got this a few years later. I think I got this maybe 2003, 2004.
Yeah.
But the reason I bring this up, Bob mentioned with Blood and Roses that Cherry Red contacted him through MySpace. Was that the same for Ausgang? Because it feels like with this generation of bands and the sort of run of reissues that began appearing around that time, it was in its infancy, but still influential in getting these bands back together.
Absolutely. Basically, they got in touch to say, would you be interested in us putting out an Ausgang compilation? And I said, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't we be? It's been so long. In fact, the members of the band, we weren't actually in touch with each other much at that time. I was vaguely in touch with Matthew, the guitarist. And so I was kind of speaking for everybody, and then basically, kind of scrabbling around trying to find out where they all lived. I needed to get in touch with everybody. But in the meantime, I selected the tracks, I liaised with the art guy, did the liner notes, all of that jazz. But I was absolutely knocked out. I was just like, well, yeah, this it'd be fantastic. I'd love to do it again. I'd love this music to go out. I had no idea of us reforming. I had no idea of us doing any shows. It was literally just this retrospective. So I was really, really surprised, but, really flattered that they approached us. And of course we did it.
Do you think, now, I need to be careful how to phrase this really. Do you think there's a place for social media in the discovery of new music? Because obviously back then when Ausgang and your peers were around, getting the word out was much different, much more reliant on word of mouth, fanzines, which we'll talk about later, flyers, and music magazines and things like that. But on the underground, there was no easy way of doing it. Do you think there's a place for social media in discovering new music now?
I think there is a place for social media. I mean, for all the obvious ills, I think it's a great tool. I'm on it every day. All I'm trying to do from a personal point of view is push the band, push my artwork, and push my movement instruction. That's all I do. I'm very, very careful to make everything positive. I don't use social media for, a soapbox to talk about what pisses me off with society. And I use it for discovering, I listen to BBC Radio 6 music every day, so I'm discovering music that way. But I discover new music through social media as well. It's put me in touch with not only fans of the band, but also other bands. So we're all exchanging ideas. I've been asked to guest vocal on a couple of other bands' albums via social media. I just, if it had been around first time we were around, then it would have been a totally different story. I mean, Ausgang are doing better now than we ever did when we were going, around first time round. I think it's just a brilliant tool, but, how we use that tool. This conversation has happened everywhere, all over social media. How we use that tool is obviously down to us.
I think that's perhaps the difference, isn't it? And actually could feed back into the conversation about why scenes thrive in different places better than others. Because
sure,
I think for my generation and younger, possibly more so the younger generation, there's an expectation to be on social media, and that if you're not, there's some sort of pernicious reason why. Is that how the American tour came about? Did they contact you through social media?
Yeah, I mean, certainly via social media, but also through, just, I was going to say old-fashioned, but in inverted commas, old-fashioned emails.
Old-fashioned email.
But certainly, yeah, it's got to be most of the contact we have with promoters abroad comes through social media.
Yep.
So it was just a matter of, would you like to do this date? Would you like to do this date? And then we just started to piece the the connections together. And I must admit, a lot of it comes through me. Like I say, I'm on social media all the time. As more and more offers were made, I started to feel I kind of need some help here, which is why I approached Songs of Praise, who do they're DJs, but also they do a radio show. They were already in touch with us, playing our music and kind of asking, would you like to do some UK shows? And I knew that they were experienced in promoting shows, so I actually asked their help in terms of, listen, can you give me a hand here? It seems a bit overwhelming. I don't want to just be the only guy who's taking care of business here. Can you offer me some advice? Which they did, and they were great. And there's another connection there, because our new bass player is one half of Songs of Praise, Sarah. The initial contact mostly came through social media, and then it was just joining the dots.
Sure, yeah. And you are active on social media, as you say, because I saw something you posted the other day, 2 or 3 days ago now, called At the Mermaid, which is a book project, I believe, about the Mermaid, which is, for anybody who doesn't know, essentially launched the British grindcore scene. It was the hub of DIY in Birmingham. It's effectively a pub with an upstairs live room.
Yeah.
And tell us about your experiences of playing there, because I know Ausgang played there. What are your memories of it? Because it's a legendary venue.
Yeah, we played there a few times, and I have to say my memory is a little sketchy. And this is the reason I've been putting a lot of my thoughts and memories down and my girlfriend has been the one who's been encouraging me to do this. Oh, Mark, you should write your autobiography. Well, it's a bit of a grand project, even if people were interested. But a lot of it has been down to me, kept diaries religiously for a long, long time, got rid of when I scaled down my possessions to live on a single-decker bus. And I really regret getting rid of those old diaries. So this process of getting a lot of my memories down is really interesting on a number of levels. But I did an interview with Sarah about the Mermaid, and it's interesting. I've got notes of when we played the Mermaid, but my memories of actually doing the shows are very sketchy. All I know is that it was a great scene. I went to other shows there as well. I saw Hanoi Rocks there, as well as some of the more hardcore gigs. And I do remember it being pretty scuzzy. It was very, very, hardcore punk rock vibe. It stunk. The toilets were abysmal. But if you wanted to pay £1.50 and see 3 or 4 bands in a night, and take your life into your hands by drinking their god awful beer, then man, you were on a winner, because Daz Russell and a couple of other promoters really went out on a limb in terms of putting some super cool bands there. Even American bands coming through like the Swans. It was just a great, great venue. I have to say, it wasn't my favorite venue. I loved Barbarella's more. I loved the Cedar Club more, but that was a little earlier. So the Mermaid was definitely of its time, kind of early 80s. But I'd been going to many, many venues for many, many years previous to that, both as a punter and also playing. But it was a great venue. It was a really, really cool vibe in Birmingham, which was pretty down at heel in those years. So it was great, fantastic times.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Tell me about, I told you we were going to jump all over the place. Tell me about the reunion this time round, because you got back together, I think it was just over a year ago now. For those who don't know, Ausgang did reunite in the mid-2000s, did quite a few gigs, put out a mini-album, Licked, on CD. This reunion feels different to me, more different energy. Tell me about how it came about.
Yeah, it does feel different. Interestingly, it was that compilation that you've mentioned that kick-started us reforming. Like I mentioned, I had no real interest or even thought of reforming. But when that album came out, a number of promoters around the world thought that it meant that we had reformed. So I was fielding these requests for us to get back together. And initially I was like, no, that's done and dusted. And it was actually the then bass player, Stuart, who said, oh, come on, let's just go out and have some fun. So we did. We went all over the world and we had a ball. It was fantastic. This time round, in fact, there was another catalyst that encouraged us to reform. I stumbled across a box of old cassettes that were demos of early kabuki, early ausgang. I had no way of playing them, and I just thought it'd be lovely to be able to kind of play these and then go back in time. And I just happened to mention this to a guy called Paul Rabjohn, who we were in touch online, and he said, "Listen, send them to me. I'll digitize them and I'll send them back to you." So we did. And I was just completely knocked out. They sound, I mean, I know I would say this, but they sounded great. I ran them by Matthew, the guitarist, and said, these are brilliant. What do you think? How can we get them out there? Because I really think that we ought to. I just happened to mention it to Mick Mercer, the journalist and DJ, and he said, stick them up on Bandcamp. People will just eat them up. I'd not heard of Bandcamp at this point. But I researched it and I thought, okay, yeah, know how to do it now. So I did it. People started buying the stuff. And once again, I started fielding requests for, are you guys reforming? Because if you are, will you come and do this show? And so it all started again. And it feels different this time. I mean, the lineup is different. We've got a new drummer, got a new bass player. But this time round, I'm using, just to go back to a previous conversation, social media in a way that I didn't do the first time we reformed, even though there was MySpace. I think Stu, the bass player, got us some presents on MySpace, but I was nothing to do with that. If we'd have been doing what I'm doing now, I think probably the momentum would have continued and we'd have stayed together. There wouldn't have been a disbanding again, and that disbanding was only an organic thing. It didn't. There wasn't like a conscious moment where we said, "Oh no, we've had enough now." It just organically come to an end. But this time round, because of social media, I'm noticing that there's a lot more action and interaction with promoters and fans.
So we must mention This Is Our Downfall. A collection of demos, unreleased tracks by Kabuki, early Ausgang, still available on Bandcamp, I believe.
Yes.
Beautifully packaged. I'll put a link in the description.
Thank you.
How much has it surprised you listening to those tracks? Could you believe, oh my God, I can't believe we left this on the cutting room floor, because there's some amazing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talk, Matthew and I, because we're the founding members, we often talk about, we don't think that Ausgang was ever recorded properly. And I'm not saying, that the producers that we had and the technicians and blah, 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 and the wasn't up to it. Of course it was, but I don't think we knew what to do or how we were meant to come across. And those early demos, they capture a very, very raw quality that, we would be difficult to capture now because we'd want to make it, not a little more polished. But I love the raw quality. Those kabuki demos knocked me out because they'd just been put by the wayside when kabuki turned into ausgang. And we've also talked about the possibility of re-recording a couple of those numbers just to see if we can do something else with them. The guy who put the album together in Poland did a really good job of getting rid of some of the hiss on those old demos, and I think it sounds great.
They sound fantastic. They really do. And they sound like demos.
Sure.
But that's okay. But they sound very, very well recorded for the time.
Yeah. We had a great guy, a guy called Rob Bruce at Rich Bitch Studios. Rich Bitch, you couldn't get away with having studios called that anymore, could you? But he was brilliant, and he was a big fan of the band, and he was really, really helpful. And yeah, he really captured that raw quality. I think later, when we were trying to make proper recordings, when we got signed to Criminal Damage and then Heavy Metal FM, it was then that we didn't really know how to make that transition from demo to a proper recording. I mean, they're fine. I still play vinyl. But if we'd have known a bit more then maybe they'd have been slightly better.
What are your plans from here then? Because new music has appeared, Resurrection Man.
Sure.
Produced by Chris Sheldon, who has a staggering resume. He's produced Feeder, one of my favourite bands, early favourite bands. Is there more new music on the way? What do you envision for Ausgang going forward?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of the things that are up on Bandcamp, but literally in the last couple of days, we've been talking about writing more new material. There is actually, because Resurrection Man and Lone Bell and a couple of the reworkings of older tracks are essentially me and Matthew. But we want to get Victor and Sarah on board in terms of songwriting. It's really tricky, though, because logistically, we all live in different parts of the country. So we rehearse in London. Sarah has to come down from Bradford, and Victor from Leamington Spa, me from down south. Matthew's already in London. It's really, we tend to rehearse when we've got a show coming up. But what I've suggested is each of us working on our parts, and then when we do rehearse, start putting them together. We're talking about the possibility of a single, a vinyl single, another album, whether or not that's crowdfunded or whether there's somebody out there that wants to help us with that. For instance, the guys in Poland, maybe. So yeah, we've got already, I think, 4 or 5 new songs. I've written the lyrics. Matthew's working on some guitar parts. Now it's down to Sarah and Victor to come up with their parts. So there's quite a bit of new material on its way.
That's so great to hear, Mark. I'm really excited about that because when the reunion came about last year, and obviously Terry McClay was with you then from Sex Gang, I was thinking, yes, let's have it. But to step away from music for a moment, you mentioned free movement briefly there. Can you explain for people what that entails and kind of because you have turned it into a business and it's something you've done away from music. Can you tell me how that came about and how you got into movement?
Sure. Basically, I've done physical disciplines all my life. Since I was 14, I went along to Bruce Lee movies, and I started Kung Fu when I was 14, moved into wrestling, fencing, then yoga. And I started teaching yoga in 2000 and basically turned it into my business. I was teaching full time for 22 years. I started to see the holes in yoga. And so I've always been researching, health and fitness. And I started to realize that I knew now enough about physical disciplines to actually put together all the best bits and get rid of the rubbish. And so movement, even though it's kind of a loose term, and I know, as you say, unless you're involved in this area, it's, well, what does that mean? Essentially, it's body weight conditioning, like calisthenics. And that's what I do now. I only work on a one-to-one basis. I did have a studio where I ran regular classes for 9 years, but the pandemic put paid to that. So now it's very much part-time and it's one-to-one. The rest of my time is taken up with ausgang and my art. But in terms of reaping the benefits from dedicating your life to health and fitness, which I've done. So for 46 years, I've trained almost every day. So I'm 62. The end of this year, I'll be 63. I don't quite feel like it, and Jack. Thank you very much, man. Jackie, who's just brought in, has been saying, "Oh, Mark, you should make more of this. That you're, 62, and in terms of trying to get it out to people that you don't have to wind down. You do not have to become old and frail. Of course, our bodies decay. We know that, but you can do something to make the whole of your life very, very healthy." And just going back a step to me putting down my ideas and my memories onto this laptop that I'm speaking to you on now, it was a bit of fun, but I actually was thinking of a title for it. And I thought, okay, comic books, punk rock, and movement, in brackets, or how I learned how to live forever. Because I found that being involved in the music industry, I know it can go bad ways in terms of, an unhealthy lifestyle. And I've had my experiences of that too. But in terms of comic books that keep me young, music that keeps me young, and physical disciplines keep me young, putting all those three things together, I've discovered the fountain of eternal youth. So, that's why I do it.
It's all true as well. All that stuff people tell you about physical disciplines being good for your mental health as well as physical well-being, it's all true. I used to do Pilates a lot, and I used to find it was a really good declutterer of the mind. And you're obviously a very physical performer on stage. Do you think that in doing the physical disciplines away from performance, they give you a clarity of mind when approaching a live performance that you might not have got if you didn't do that?
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. I mean, it's a known scientific fact that if you're regularly exercising, then it has a knock-on effect to your mental health. I can attest to that, and I can see in the people that I've worked with also. But yeah, I mean, not only the rigors of being on the road, it's not like we're on the road like we used to be back in the day, but certainly I can cope with the physicality of being on the road and the physicality of doing a live show in a way that I don't think I could if I wasn't physically fit. And I'm certainly not the only one. I know many, many people who will say the same thing. But certainly, my focus on stage has a lot to do with what I do in the background. I train every single day, whether it be, even if it's just an hour, I will train. Even if it's bad weather, I train outdoors these days. If it's bad weather, I just wrap up and I train. So a minimum, and I'm not saying that everybody has to do this, but this is just for me. I tend to be a bit obsessive with stuff like this, but a minimum of an hour every single day, it'll do it. It can't fail.
I mean, I've got to say, it's not to the same degree, but I work from home a lot these days. With my job, I work in marketing. It's my day job. And I find that I'm very lucky, I live in the countryside. If I don't get up and go for a walk before I start work, I don't feel ready for the day. And I feel like my brain is not engaged in the same way. The neurons aren't firing. How can I phrase this? What does performing give you? And do you think it exercises a different part of your brain or comes from a different part of your brain to the movement, or is it the same?
Yeah, they're separate. That's a good question. I've not actually thought about it before, but they are definitely separate. I'm in a different space when I'm training. I'm very, very focused. I'm very, very careful. I don't throw myself around. On stage, I tend to throw myself around, but there is a degree of control. I don't want to slip over and hurt myself or look like a fool in front of a couple of hundred people or whatever it is. I am taking care, but there's an excitability, there's an organic quality. My training is pretty regimented, but only because I know what I want to do before I do it. And certainly when we do a show, I want it to be a great show. And I'm not saying that all eyes are on me, because, I've got 3 good-looking bandmates, and so I know that eyes are on them too. But we've all got our different things, I guess, that we want to put across. And also, of course, we're a team. I'm running around like a mad thing on stage, but I am interacting with the other guys too. I want to, I'll go over and throw my arm, in true rock and roll fashion, around Matthew's shoulder. And these days, now that not the first time, we did have a female in the band in Kabuki. But for a long, long time, it's always been a male outfit. But now we've got a female in the band, Sarah on bass. It's a different dynamic. It looks different, and I'm interacting with her in a different kind of way than I would be with a male bass player. So yeah, there are some parallels between what I do, physically when I'm training and when we're on stage, but there are big differences.
Sure. So we're going to jump around again. Tell us about growing up in Birmingham, and were you interested in or exposed to performance or forms of art from a young age? Tell me about your childhood.
Yeah, I mentioned comic books. I was a 60s child, born in 1960, and so I reckon from about 1966, 67, tricky to put a pin on it, but I was collecting American superhero comic books, and that has gone all the way through to right now. I love them. I think they're pieces of awesome art. In the early days, I used to copy the comic books, and then I started to make my own. That also meant that I used to write, the kind of dialogue that would go into the speech balloons, etc., etc. And so, comic books really were my life. For a long, long time, I religiously collected them. I regret getting rid of a lot of them when I scaled down my possessions, but I've built up my collection again. They've become very, very expensive now, unless you're really, really patient, since the advent of superhero movies. But nevertheless, that was my first, I would say, artistic expression. At school, I excelled in English and art, and that had a knock-on effect in that I ended up going to art college. And then I started to study fine art at Birmingham University. They kicked me out after a year for being a naughty little punk rocker, but it's by the by. But so art carried on through my life, and that fed into the band as well. I wasn't the only one, but I tended to be the one who came up with the artwork, or a lot of the artwork, for the band. And also writing lyrics. That's an artistic expression as well. I could string 2 words together. And in fact, when I stopped performing after the band broke up and I tried a couple of other bands, I actually went into music journalism, and I made, a very, very meager living for a good few years being a freelancer. And so there's always been an artistic bent, and it's recently resurfaced again in me trying to push my illustrations, my art once again.
2 questions there then. Because obviously, you do the artwork for Ausgang, give the band its visual identity, and a very striking visual identity at that. I guess to repeat myself a little bit, what does drawing give you, and do you think that comes from the same place within you as performing music? And have you always been able to draw? Because obviously, like any skill, you get better with practice, but I think with some people, it can be innate, can't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it came from comic books. I don't think I was doodling on paper before I started reading, comic books, and I had my favorite artists, and so I would just try and copy them. I think definitely comic books were a catalyst in bringing a visual art out of me. And certainly when I had a vehicle for my art, i.e. the band, suddenly I was able to kind of, get really creative. I wasn't constrained by little boxes. And more recently, when I'm revisiting my art, I'm really enjoying how surreal I can be. I can do anything. And I'm very much old school. I'm just putting pen to paper. At some point, maybe I'll experiment with digital art, but I'm in no great rush. I'm really enjoying, the physicality of using my fingers as well as my brain. But it also goes back to, I've been an avid reader forever. And a lot of my lyrical ideas came from William Burroughs, came from Jack Kerouac, Tom Wolfe, came from Hunter S. Thompson, where, there's a lot of exaggerated reality. And so that fed into my lyrics. And I'm finding that I'm able to feed, having gone through, my whole life reading, feeding some of those ideas and inspirations into my new art. So I'm just trying to weave a whole bunch of things together.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I draw a little bit too, not as much as I should do these days. But it's interesting because I think it's different from music in terms of a form of art or artistic expression, because I think unless you're somebody like Paul McCartney who dreams of music and then wakes up and knocks out yesterday, as is the story he often tells, I think drawing is something that requires you to chip away at it. And I like the technical element of it in the sense that your brain always feels like it's one step ahead of you. In the sense of, no, I want this part to be more exaggerated. I want this colour here, and I want to move that to there. And there are synapses going on all the time. But at the same time, it's a very physical thing, isn't it? Like you said, the act of actually putting pen to paper is a physical thing that you... what am I trying to say? You do sort of create your own space, don't you, around it, and you interact with the paper and what you're doing.
Absolutely. What kind of stuff do you do? What has it got? Would you say that you fall into a particular genre or style of art?
I mean, I don't experiment as much as I should do, really. I've got this thing about faces. I love drawing faces, and not so much. I try to get them as realistic as possible, not in terms of photorealism, but just it's the expression for me. Getting behind the eyes, trying to bring the person's personality through. And if I feel I've done that, then I consider it to be successful. And there is something, saying it's different to music, there is something romantic about putting pen to paper and, like I said before, interacting with what you're doing in a physical way. And I think you can I guess draw a parallel to music in that regard, perhaps, in that it's just you, your piece of art, what you're trying to achieve, and that's it. You're just doing it for the sake of doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, great. I'd like to see some of your stuff.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'll have to send something to you. Let's talk about music then. Was it always there for you?
Yeah, I mean, music has always been around. I mean, even before I was aware of the charts in the late 60s and early 70s, Mum and Dad were always playing music. Mum was more into, rock and roll, Elvis Presley, Duane Eddy. Dad was into his country music, very much into Johnny Cash. And that was just seeping into my subconscious. So I knew off by heart a whole bunch of Johnny Cash songs before I knew, who Johnny Cash was. And then I was just at the right age for glam rock. So T-Rex, Bowie, all the usual suspects, Rock's music especially, were just, my constants. And it sounds a bit of a cliche now, but a lot of people of my age who were listening to that kind of stuff and all that kind of stuff was just in the charts. There wasn't anything kind of alternative about it. But nevertheless, those of us who were really digging that, we ended up falling almost by default into punk rock, I think I went to my first show in 1976. I think I was a late starter in going to gigs because by 1977, I was going to punk rock gigs. And then my second home was Barbarella's, which no longer exists in Birmingham anymore. But I used to live there. They would put shows on almost every night, not every night, but almost every night. So from a very early age, music was really important to me. I was buying singles, I was buying albums, a lot of which I've still got, many of which I haven't. It's just very, very important. When I started going to see punk rock gigs at Barbarella's, there was hardly anybody there for some of the more obscure punk rock bands, but packed when it was Susie and the Banshees and when it was the Damned, etc., etc. But I remember seeing my first punk rock gig, which was the Boys. I think there were about 15 people in the room, and I just thought it was again another cliche coming up. I can do that. I'm sure I can do that. My first band was a band in name only, because me and my buddies were, I'll be the singer, I'll be the bass player. Nobody could play anything. Nobody had any instruments, but we just liked the idea of being in a band. That ended up turning into a reality with other people. My first punk rock band was the Solicitors, and that fed into Kabuki, which fed into Ausgang. So music from a very early age was so important to me.
I think a Bowie moment and a Roxy moment for artists of your generation, particularly, it seems like, were crucial. And it's interesting because in his excellent book, if you haven't read it, John Robb, The Art of Darkness, he mentions Bowie being ground zero. And I can see why he's had some pushback on that, but at the same time, I can also see why he said that, and I do agree with it to a certain extent, because I think particularly for Bowie and Roxy music, I see parallels there between post-punk and this period in terms of pure self-expression filtered through performance. And, particularly for them, they were pushing the envelope. And although there was a degree of glamour attached to it, there was more of a sense of adventure and of coming at it from the left field and thinking, what's over here? What's over here? And never being afraid to reinvent themselves and, by extension, what would come later. So you talked about the Solicitors then. What was the climate like in that sort of post-punk era in Birmingham?
It was great. I mean, it was really, really, it was really edgy. It was really grimy. It was really dirty. Somebody else asked me this very question literally a few hours ago, and I likened it. I first went to New York City in the early 80s, and it was very, very edgy, dangerous. There were no-go areas, but man, was it exciting. And I knew a bunch of people over there, and they took me to punk rock clubs. It was just great. And I thought, this reminds me of Birmingham. I wouldn't dream of drawing many more parallels between 70s Birmingham and 80s New York City, but there was definitely, Birmingham was grubby, but it was alive, and certainly the clubs that I was going to were very, very, very edgy, despite my early experiences of learning martial arts, it took me a while to become handy. Before then, I was a little bit timid. So, I knew that there were certain areas in Birmingham that you were kind of asking for trouble if you walk down on your own. But I loved it, even though politically there were a lot of things wrong with the way the country was being run, and Birmingham, like other cities, was suffering. Nevertheless, I was having a great time. Yeah, it was great.
Was there a sense of pushing back? Because obviously Birmingham has a tremendous musical heritage, you can't mention Birmingham and not talk about metal and Sabbath, Priest, two bands without had they not been around, I think the alternative music landscape would be very different. Were you kind of aware of that heritage, and was there a degree with the punk rock generation in Birmingham of pushing back against that?
I wasn't overly aware of a whole bunch at the time, a whole bunch of famous bands coming from Birmingham. You mentioned the kind of glamour of a lot of the artists like Bowie and Roxy music. I think when I think of bigger bands in those days, they were unobtainable. I had no idea how you became a band, and they must be different people. Of course, we all know that there's nothing special about any of these people whatsoever. They just happen to have a few talents. There's a great book called Ordinary People, and Bowie is mentioned a lot in this, and it talks about they were just normal people, So it wasn't until punk that it became a little more, wait a second, so if I start here, I could potentially end up way over there being a superstar. So that, you got to put the work in, of course. We all know that. But it seemed slightly more attainable that, I could be up on stage. And it took a while. There was a scene in Birmingham. I wasn't overly aware in the early stages of there being other young bands. I would go to punk rock clubs, and we were all there for a reason, and we tended to be in our groups, and then we'd all go away, and then we'd all come back to Barbarella's or the Cedar Club, and then we'd go away and be in our little bands. And it wasn't until we started playing gigs that we realized, oh, wow, so the au pairs, the denizens, the prefects who became the Nightingales, so there's a network here, and that's when things started getting interesting.
It's so funny you mentioned the Nightingales today of all days, because I was listening to an interview with Stuart Lee earlier on talking about the Nightingales, because he actually directed a documentary about them, which I would really like to see, actually. But let's talk about Kabuki then, because you've mentioned there was a through line between the Solicitors, your first band, and Kabuki. Did you know the members? How did you meet? Tell me about that.
Yeah. I mean, no, I didn't know them beforehand. Basically, the Solicitors came to its natural end. The other guys in the band weren't really apart from Glyn, the second drummer that Solicitors had. He went on to do something with a couple of other bands. I can't remember, maybe the Modern Boys. What a funny name. But anyway, I think he went on to do something else. But at that time, my then girlfriend, in fact, she's recently died, which is a big shock.
It's really sad. I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, very sad. It came out of the blue, I heard from her daughter. But she was the backing vocalist in Kabuki. But she and I...
Is she the person who sings I Am a Horse?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you got it. And on a number of those other demos, riding that voice, she and I were very serious about doing something else. So basically, I advertised in all the usual places, in the record stores, etc. And at the time, I was a DJ in a venue called a nightclub called Sloopy's, and I was also asked if I'd like to help put some bands on, just some local bands. So one band that I put on, they were called Across the Room. Yeah, I'm not sure what any of the members are doing now. I don't think there was anything that remarkable about them. Sorry, guys. But there was something remarkable about their bass player, and it was Cub. And basically, straight after their set finished, I went up to him and I said, ditch this band. I'm putting a band together, and you should be the bass player for my band. He obviously looked at me as though I was crazy, but he did. So it worked. So the guitarist, we auditioned a couple of guitarists that answered the ad in record stores. But when Matthew turned up, I recognized him. I'd seen him in a band called The Detectives. Dave Haslam was involved with that band a while back, I think a venue called Fighting Cocks. So I recognized him, but I didn't know him. And he auditioned, and he was just utterly brilliant. Very much a classically trained guitarist. So he could do anything. He could play anything. And also auditioning was a guy called Mick Davis, who didn't last very long. He was superseded by Ian. But at the time, Mick, Cub, Matthew, Joe, and I. And then, so there were 6 of us in this band. Wills, he ended up on keyboards, and that became the first model of Kabuki.
Did you gig much as Kabuki? Because the one thing This Is Our Downfall collection has brought to light is the raft of material you produced in a relatively or very short space of time. Very, very prolific. I Am a Horse is a classic single. absolutely classic single. And if you're listening to this now and you haven't heard I Am a Horse, I can't imagine you wouldn't have heard it, but if you haven't heard it, shame on you.
Thanks.
Tell me about I think you mentioned it in the liner notes to the last Exit compilation. The metamorphosis from Kabuki to Ausgang was what made you aware that there were other bands mining a similar territory.
Yeah. We did do a bunch of shows, all local. We didn't. The furthest we got out was 20 miles south of Birmingham, Stratford-on-Avon. There was a pub there called the Green Dragon, and it was a show organised by my cousins who thought that they had a cousin who was already a rock god, so they organised that. But so we did a bunch of shows, and it was definitely. Kabuki was very much an art project. We were deliberately trying not to be rock and roll. So this maybe is not a good illustration of that, but nevertheless, the Gun Club and Birthday Party were our models. We didn't quite know how to do it, so our shows were pretty chaotic, and they tended to be very theatrical. When I wasn't singing, I would be brandishing a samurai sword, a proper samurai sword, and so very, very small stages. So the other members of the band were like, "Whoa, calm down!" And we had Wills, the keyboard player, rolling around on the floor. It was very much post-punk experimentation, and it was exciting. And we were making some good music, I think, and those demos attest. However, we did start to get a little pretentious. It was getting a little too arty. At the time, Cub, Matthew, Ian, the drummer, and I thought, we want this to go somewhere else now, and we want to trim it down. So we became a four-piece. So mercilessly, I kicked out my girlfriend, so obviously that relationship didn't last much longer, and the keyboard player. Sorry, Mark Wilson, he's a respected art lecturer, and we're in touch with each other now, so all water under the bridge. But that was then the transformation from Kabuki into Ausgang, and we took with us the Birthday Party pretensions, a little bit of Bauhaus in there, a little bit of Gun Club, certainly from Matthew's guitar. So very organic, but it all suddenly became a lot darker, a lot heavier.
Because I just want to put the pause button for a moment, because I want to talk about the Gun Club and Jeffrey Lee Pierce, because it is crazy to me that it took somebody that long to reach back into American blues in the way that they did and he did, and spin it back in that way. It's mad that it took that long, and yet along they came, and the records they produced, and I'll include the latter day stuff in this, Right to Lucky Jim, which I think is a great record.
Yeah,
I got bought one of those when those dance set style record players came back. Yeah. I got bought one of those, and my dad gave me Miami, and I wore that. I wore it out. I loved that record. I still love that record.
Yes.
And the sleeve, you can smell the heat and the sweat off that record and that sleeve. And yeah, magical stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And it's one of the reasons, Gun Club are one of the reasons, because I've always loved the blues. And I still, when somebody asks me to describe Ausgang, so I will always...
You can hear that in Ausgang, so I'm really glad you said that, because I've always said that.
Great. Thank you so much, because I will always put that, yes, we are punk rock, yes, we are goth, but we're also a twisted blues band, and that's what Gun Club was. And another of my big heroes is Captain Beefheart. This idea of dark, twisted blues that the Gun Club nailed really appealed to me. And I'm not, I wouldn't even dream of saying that. So I wasn't early Ausgang just like the Gun Club, of course not. But nevertheless, they were in the back of our mind all the time. Astonishing.
Because I've got to say, for anybody who is unfamiliar or not that familiar with American blues, outside of your B.B. King, nothing wrong with it, long live the king. But for anybody outside of that, the darker, more obscure artists, people like Junior Kimbrough, Mississippi Fred McDowell, and particularly the acoustic masters, people like Leadbelly, people like Blind Lemon Jefferson, would have no difficulty, I don't believe, recognising a lead belly in what you do.
Thank you. That is an amazing compliment, because I think that old blues music, especially the dark stuff that you're talking about, is like there are parallels with punk rock.
Absolutely, yeah.
You put the politics aside. I've always considered, I've tried my hand at writing political songs. It doesn't quite work for me. So not every song I write, but a lot of my material is about sex and death, a few motorcycles and drugs and blah, blah, blah. It's, the all typical cliches, but nevertheless, there's a mine of material to draw upon, even if you're covering the same old ground. So many of my songs are murder ballads. I've never murdered anybody. I'd be so scared. I have no idea what's going through somebody's mind if they murder somebody. But man, why can't I assume a character and explore an idea with that character? It's like one of our songs that we still include in the set is called Fat Vigilante. It's about a bigoted, racist Southern Baptist character, who I have no connection with at all, but nevertheless, I remember Joe Strummer talking, decades ago. Why can't I write from somebody else's point of view? I like that idea. I think it can be done.
It can, and it's when you put all these ingredients together that you have the magic, And you guys obviously had a really striking image to go along with the music, and that's a big part of it too, a big factor. And obviously you mentioned Cub before. Real name Paul Ballock, which I only found out this morning, reading the compilation liner notes, bizarrely, with, he's really tall guy, played bass in this very aggressive way, had that hair, which I've coined the Mulhawk, patent pending. Was that a natural process of, Matthew was very pretty as well. Was it a natural process of the way you developed your image, or were you like, no, we want to look like this?
No, totally organic. And, I was speaking to, going to kind of rub Ausgang's ego here. I was speaking to Miles Hunt from the Wonder Stuff. I was just on a completely different topic. And he just said this lovely thing. He said, Mark, I always love hearing from you. He said, back in the day in Birmingham, you guys were as important to me and my mates as Bowie. The way you looked, your hair, your clothes, it was just, what we all aspired to that. I was just completely taken aback, because all we were doing was expressing ourselves. It was another form of self-expression. And the thing is, in Birmingham, there were lots of other punk rockers, and I came out of looking like your regular kind of punk rocker before this look took over. But there weren't many other people in the city who looked like us, but it was just, an organic thing. And it wasn't until we started going to clubs elsewhere, Manchester, and playing elsewhere, that we started to meet not only other people who looked like us, but other bands who were mining a similar field, even though, we played with Sex Gang Children and Specimen and Alien Sex Fiend. We sounded nothing like them, and they sounded nothing like us. There's, really nothing much that connects us, other than there was a similarity in the look. We were like-minded people. We were all reading the same books. We were all citing the same movies as influences. That's all that mattered. So it was definitely an organic thing. There wasn't a plan. It was exciting. It was a really exciting time.
I've always been really fascinated by the idea or the notion of self-expression. I brought it up with Charles and Bob in the previous episodes because in some ways it feels autodidactic and that it just comes, But then at the same time, consciously or unconsciously, I think you do take influence from your environment and choose a performative action that represents in its way the truest version of yourself. So we've kind of landed here. When did you start to notice this shift towards what would become goth? Because Bob mentioned, when he was in London, it was the start of people embracing colour again in the early 80s, experimenting with haircuts and not kind of boxing themselves into, right, this is the punk look, this is this look, and just being a bit freer.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because, you know, the Batcave scene, which we were invited to, we were aware of the Batcave, but when we were invited to play, that was when we became aware of other people who were into the same kind of things. And, you know, none of us had heard this term goth for a long, long time. Ausgang were going for a while before we were suddenly lumped in with a whole bunch of other bands, and that's fine. That happens all the time. But we were given this tag, goth, that at first we were reluctant to embrace because we didn't want to be called anything. We were just Ausgang playing. You know, as far as we were concerned, we were still punk rockers. That was the odd thing. But nevertheless, we knew that we were post-punk rockers, if you like, even though we weren't using that term. We didn't want any terms attached to what we were doing. It wasn't until much later that we thought, what the hell? You know, call us what you like. It won't make any difference to what we do. We'll still dress like this and we'll still make music like this. So if you consider us punk rock or goth or positive punk or whatever it is, then go right ahead. I mean, often these terms were dreamed up by journalists anyway, some of whom liked us, some of whom hated us. It didn't matter. You know, we were going to carry on doing this thing. And I don't think that the whole goth scene really came into its own until much, much later. And so when we reformed, we had no idea of how the lie of the land was in terms of the scene. And then when we played our first Reformation show in Munster, we were headlining this big festival in Munster, and we turned up, and it was a mid-range venue. The place was jam-packed. These kids who weren't even alive first time round, clutching copies of their Ausgang vinyl and just knowing all the words, even though I couldn't remember all the words. Just throw the mic into the audience, fine. But it just made us realize it had really moved on. What I liked about that period, I think, even though punk rock was a big deal for me, it was a big, big ground zero for me. There were a lot of negative elements to it. But what I noticed in the positive punk, inverted commas, and post-punk, inverted commas, and goth, it suddenly became a lot healthier. Like you say, there's a lot more colour, but, you know, I think there were even less drugs. I've taken every drug under the sun, but most of it was when I was a naughty little punk rocker and tipping over into what became Ausgang. And then it all fell by the wayside years later. But it seems to me, especially meeting a lot of younger kids on the scene now, yes, everybody's having a nice drink, but there doesn't seem, unless they're all hiding this, there doesn't seem to be that much in the way of heavy drug use.
It's interesting because Bob mentioned this in the first episode of the podcast, that the post-punk generation were the first to really start to throw out a lot of the negative stuff around that early wave of punk bands. And I think I mentioned this in that interview, that obviously Crass were a emblematic band that started to change all of that. But in terms of post-punk, I've never really liked it as a term, because it roots itself very much rigorously into a set period. But I think the way I choose to interpret it is this idea of using the grassroots energy of punk, having that dumb idea and just doing it, but taking that energy and experimenting with forms away from Western music, which punk was still rooted in.
Yeah, I agree. And you presumably have read Simon Reynolds' Rip It Up and Start Again.
Yeah, excellent book. Excellent.
What a great book. And I think he expands on what you've just said. Yes, we had that energy and that drive of punk rock, but we wanted to do something else. And certainly that was the idea behind Kabuki. And then it just morphed into Ausgang. So we were trying to do exactly that. Hit the nail on the head.
Where did the difficulty come in with Ausgang? Because We'll talk about Sex Gang Children later, because there is a kinship there with them in the way that they would change tempo, time signature, and so on. You've written about this and spoken about this in interviews, in the Gothic Rock Companion book with Mick Mercer, liner notes, and like I say, with Sex Gang, there's a vinyl behind me. Where was this coming from, these changes in time signature? Because it almost felt like you were trying to catch the audience out. It was difficult to dance to. Talk to me about the writing process. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when you guys were putting this together.
Oh yeah, we certainly didn't make life easy for ourselves. We were never going to be on top of the pops. There's too much swearing, and to watch people trying to dance to our music was kind of amusing. But then again, we were trying to dance to our music as well, and so we were all falling over each other's, tripping over each other's feet. Really interesting about the time signature thing. I don't think I personally would have even known what was being referenced to had it not been for Matthew. Matthew, I mentioned earlier, was classically trained.
I was just going to say, did that come from him?
Totally, yeah. So I'd never heard of Shostakovich, but he had, because his late father, was a music professor at Birmingham University. And it's like, and so Matthew would say, so guys, where we're doing this, it's quite chuggy, it's quite groovy, it's quite rockable. How about then 4/4 becomes, and then, he would just do something else. And we would go, oh my God, that is brilliant. That is fantastic. I don't know what you've done there, but let's continue it. And it almost became something that Ausgang did. And we even had a song called County Hunters, in brackets, you just can't count on us, because you can't. It's like we'll fuck it up in some way, shape or form, for good or ill. It changed. It changed organically. I think at one point, we were trying to see if we could court the mainstream, not in a real obvious way, but what about that? It couldn't possibly change the way I personally wrote my lyrics, although I think I mentioned earlier, I tried to write the political song and it doesn't sit well with me. It sounds a bit forced. It feels like I'm preaching to the converted. So I tried it for a while, then just went back to writing about, what I knew intimately inside myself, or just kind of observe. A big part of early Ausgang was definitely Cub's bass playing. He played bass like...
I tell you what, we talk about reading my mind earlier on, because I've got a bunch of questions up in front of me and you've almost read that word for word.
Okay, I'll try to keep doing that, the mind reading bit, to a minimum from now on. But he played bass guitar like a lead guitar, and very, very fluid, very, very...
The sound that he had was so unique. It was very brittle, but it was thunderous and it drove the band.
Yeah.
It really takes your head off, and even if you play it through a phone, it cuts through everything, and it feels like you built a lot of the arrangements around that.
Yeah. I mean, we were all instrumental in the songwriting. It wasn't just... I mean, I wrote all the lyrics. I would find it very, very difficult to sing somebody else's lyrics unless we are doing a cover. We've done a few covers over the years, but I needed to write the lyrics, and the rest of the band understood that. But Matthew would come up the guitar, Ian the bass, Cub, Ian the drums, Cub the bass. We'd all have an input in each other's part, but essentially, we were all kind of in command of our role. Cub was definitely influenced by Jean-Jacques Bernal and Tracy Pugh. Matthew, he loved Tom Verlaine's television guitar, and also his previous band, the Detectives, who I mentioned, they were very much Dr. Feelgood. So there was that scratchy, angular element, which I think featured in a lot of post-punk bands, and certainly Ian's drumming. He's self-taught as he became a member of Ausgang. Very little in the way of cymbals, so there's definitely a Kenny Morris type Banshees drum element there.
I think two bands that get overlooked in this conversation, not left out, overlooked. UK Decay, firstly, who were much more punk than, say, Bauhaus, but turned into something very, very singular, particularly with Rising from the Dread, For Mad Men Only. Those records are so influential and so brilliant, but perhaps too late for that initial interest with Bauhaus, too early for the likes of you guys, for Sex Gang, but brilliant nonetheless. The other, and perhaps because of what they became later, was Adam and the Ants with their first album, Dirt Wears White Socks, which is, that really feels, if you listen to that now in the context of when that came out, that felt like a pivotal moment.
I was just, a very, very early supporter of the early Adam and the Ants. And in fact, I even liked what he did when, he changed, up to a point. I saw him, many times. But yeah, that period, Dirt Wears White Socks, man, that was so influential on me. I wouldn't necessarily, there are a few elements. If you listen to one of our tracks is Your Role is to Tease as You Roll in the Lens, there's definitely an antsy feel there. And sometimes some of the backing vocals, you can hear something that potentially could come from a chanty ants thing. But yeah, I absolutely agree. Absolutely game-changing album. Yeah.
So 1984 really felt like your year because Teachings of Webb, Head On, and Solid Glass Spine, which is possibly my favourite of your records, all came out then. How did you hook up with Criminal Damage Records, who put those out, and what was driving you at the time? Because you were incredibly prolific for an independent band, and it felt like there was no stopping you.
Yeah, I would say that 1983-84 was Ausgang's best year. In a different way to what we're doing now, because for all the reasons that we've talked about, things are different. We're all, we're grown up. We couldn't possibly look or sound, not necessarily sound, but certainly it would be a very different, it's a very different Ausgang. But 83-84, I think, was early Ausgang's heyday. And believe it or not, the whole Criminal Damage thing came from Chris Green writing me a letter, handwritten letter, and I've still got it in my scrapbook, saying, "Dear Ausgang, please sign to Criminal Damage, love Criminal Damage." And I was like, yeah, all right, okay. There was no money in it. It was just brilliant. We never even met the guy. It couldn't happen now, He put out such an amazing selection of music, and I really hope that rumor that I've heard from his son that Cherry Red potentially may put out the back catalogue, I really hope it's correct. I think that would be brilliant.
That would be incredible, because I was actually, funnily enough, I was going through Discogs last night and I was looking at the Criminal Damage catalogue because there's so much good stuff there, and it's really diverse as well, really eclectic, Yeah. A lot of good stuff.
Yeah, very much so. And those were our best records, definitely. I don't even know how it came. I can't remember. Maybe I'll have to have a chat with Matthew about this. I can't quite remember how it happened that we quit Criminal Damage. I've got a feeling they were drawing to a close anyway, possibly. But then we had the offer from Heavy Metal FM, which, it's all a bit hazy, but that was a weird jump, because Criminal Damage, we were at home, but they didn't have any money. And certainly Heavy Metal FM did have some money. And that may have been one of the deciding factors. I'm not proud of how personally we handled that deal, because we walked away from that record company in a way that we shouldn't have been allowed to, because we didn't sign a contract. And so when we felt, you guys don't know how to handle us, we're walking. Well, you can't walk. No, we're not signed. It's like, oh my God, it makes me cringe to think about it. But it certainly wasn't a good fit. The whole Heavy Metal FM was not a good fit. No disrespect to those guys, but we were a very different band to the other bands on their roster, whereas we had some kinship with the bands on Criminal Damage.
Yeah, I was going through the FM Records catalogue last night, and there's some great stuff there, but it is hard to see the parallels, really, and why they went for you guys and you to them, really. Magnum, the best I could do was, they're from Birmingham too. They put out On a Storyteller's Night, in 1983, which was their sort of defining record. Head On, produced by Andy Sexgang, though.
Yeah.
Tell me about how that coupling came about, because I know you played gigs together.
Yeah.
What was he like to work with in terms of in the studio? Because he very, very spontaneous and a lot of ideas.
Yeah, he was great. I mean, once again, that was a very, I hesitate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, it was a very drug, hazy time. And so I can remember Andy coming in and doing exactly that, very spontaneous. You know, I've never considered myself a singer. I consider myself a vocalist. And I think there's a big difference. You know, there's no warble at the end of my voice because I can't sing like that. And I don't think that necessarily makes somebody a good singer, just a different kind of singer. But Andy is a good singer. And he came up with a couple of ideas that ordinarily I wouldn't have, even thought of. But he said, so Max, I was known as Max. Max, why don't you try this? And at first I was a bit reticent, but when he encouraged me, it was like, oh yeah. And he also added some backing vocals to a couple of the tracks. So yeah, he was very, very inventive, very experimental, and it would have been interesting to do some other work with him, but it was just that one off. But yeah, that was a great time.
Yeah, Andy's great, and I think whether it's with Sexgang, solo, or anything else he does, his experimental stuff, I think I've got most of it, and I love what he does, and I really don't think he ever gets the credit he deserves. Underrated talent.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I'm not in touch with him anymore. I bumped into him. We were on the same bill at a Drop Dead festival. I think it was Prague, many years ago. But I'm aware of, we follow each other on Facebook, so I'm very aware of what he's doing, even though I haven't seen him for a long, long time. But yeah, I'd agree. I think he's got a great talent. Yeah.
Tell me then how you went from those singles to the Manipulate album, because I think if any record from this period is ripe for reappraisal, it's that. Some Kind Soul has ripped the vinyl onto YouTube, the audio, so I will post a link to that in the description. I love this record. I guess that's my hill to die on for this. It's produced by Ian O'Higgins, who did Johnny Thunders, Jazz Butcher, Rebella Ballet. Good resume there. Didn't lose the intensity, but began to bring in a cleaner, more sophisticated sound. Tell me about your memories of recording that and what you think of it now. Because, yeah, love this album.
Yeah, absolutely. I still stand by that album. I stand by all our stuff. I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think we would record them differently. If we were repeating the process now. But yeah, I think it would be cool to get Manipulate out there again, because as you say, it's hard to come by. But I love all the songs. I mean, there are a couple of songs I would approach differently from a vocals point of view. I stand by all the lyrics. They can still they're good to go, but certainly a couple of songs I'd like to have another go at from a vocal perspective. But in terms of the overall feel, yeah, I still love the album. I love the artwork. I love the booklet. I love the lyrical content. Yeah, I stand by it.
I was listening to some of the latter day tracks the other day just to kind of refamiliarize myself with them. When you changed the name to Ausgang-kabuki, bit of a change of sound as well. But again, you were kind of heading in a more streamlined direction anyway, it felt like, with Manipulate. Bacchus Larkos was probably the standout song from the A-Go-Go period. Tell me about that. What prompted the name change and what sadly brought about the demise of the band? Because, again, there's some really overlooked material there.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean. Certainly Manipulate was very different from the previous records, where I think we were just, for want of a better term, I think we were simplifying a little what we were doing, perhaps moving away from that chaotic time signature changing thing that epitomized early Ausgang, and then we were getting really frustrated. It seemed like the only people who were buying the records were the people who were turning up to the shows. We didn't seem to make any kind of crossover in any direction. Of course, we wanted to be successful. Why wouldn't we be? All bands, all artists want to be successful. Surely you want to get across to as many people as possible. It's almost as if we started to see the writing on the wall. Manipulate was good. We toured it. We toured with Gene Loves Jezebel. We had a great time doing a lot of shows, but it was becoming a bit tiring. It was becoming a bit tiring because we couldn't see where we were going to go after that. So we almost jokingly discussed, wouldn't it be interesting if we just slightly tweak the name? Ausgang-kabuki sounds kind of cool. It's got the go-go kind of thing. And we even came up with go into a go-go thing, but we changed the words, and Matthew came up with a very cool lick. I'm not sure we could have put this into these kind of words then, but if we are going to call it a day, we'll be the ones who call it a day in terms of somebody else telling us, you know what, guys, you should call it a day. So there was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek quality to the ausgang-kabuki, but it ended up being prophetic. We couldn't survive.
Entirely on your own terms, as opposed to somebody else kind of putting the brakes on your behalf. And so you went from there into working in journalism, is that right?
Yeah. Very, very quickly, I actually put a little band together called Lean Steel, which actually the name came from part of an old Ausgang song called Built with Lean Steel. And very, very quickly, I got some shows on the back of, I wasn't too proud of this, but, Lean Steel in brackets, Max ex-Ausgang, but it got some shows. The Wonder Stuff very, very kindly took us out on tour, or part of their tour. And so it had some legs, but it wasn't satisfying. And another couple of little outfits that I tried, same. But in the background, I started to get involved in music journalism. And that was hard too, but at least it kept me in touch with the industry, even though I wasn't performing anymore. That led to concert promotion. I worked for a big concert promoter called MCP. Don't think they're around anymore. Concert promotion, artist management. Tried my hand at a little label, and then thought, do you know what? I've been studying yoga for 5 years. I'm really good at this. I'm going to ditch the industry and just teach yoga for a living.
Saying about journalism, though, you were involved in fanzine culture as well. Jumping back to that, I do think culture is the word too, because pre-internet, it was the way, or the best way, for fans who were passionate about music to interact with other fans and also with bands in the independent scene. Now, fanzines, for those of you who don't know, they were fan-produced magazines which covered a particular music scene. This could be regional, this could be national, but they covered a specific scene, or even sometimes specific bands. There were loads of them around in the post-punk era. There was Artificial Life, Whippings and Apologies. There was Kill Your Pet Puppy. You had your own as well, Stab the Sun. Some bands had their own.
Yeah.
They all had great titles. You did all the artwork for Stab the Sun as well, kind of enhancing your visual aesthetic. Tell me about the importance of that pre-internet, because it's hard to explain now.
Absolutely. I mean, fanzine culture was just brilliant. I had all of those, and I can't believe I don't have them. But anyway, I was always buying fanzines, always reading them. Every gig you went to, there was a fanzine being sold. And so because of our artistic bent, perhaps more so mine, but certainly the other band members pitched in as well, whether it be, the words or some art. It seemed like an obvious thing to do. It was just an extension of, just like when we did a kabuki show, we would pretentiously have a program that everybody was issued with as they walked in through the door. This is what's going to happen. There's going to be a dance troupe, and then there's going to be a little compere, and then there's going to be kabuki. It was just... Actually, I think it was genius, but it was also very pretentious. But anyway, when we started when we had kabuki, we thought we should have our own fanzine, and that was Between Thy Hips. There was only one issue, because almost immediately Kabuki became Ausgang, but by then we'd got the bug. We loved collage, we loved montage, we loved being very, very rude and risque, and we got a lot of flack in the early days from the kind of stuff that we were putting in Stab the Sun. But anyway,
it reads like a copy of Viz, you know.
Yeah, not quite sophisticated as Viz, but nevertheless, we had so much fun and got into so much trouble. And you could buy copies in the Birmingham Virgin record store and other Swordfish, Inferno, etc. It was just great fun. Lasted 8 issues, and then boom, Ausgang had run its course, and so did the fanzine. But we also invited contributions from fans and also other people like Mick Mercer and Dave Roberts and other bands as well. So I remember John Robb with the Membranes, because we played with them quite a few times back in the day, and he contributed something. So there was always something, some way of connecting us, interacting with, even though it took a long time because it was all by mail, but nobody knew any different, with connecting with the fans and other people on the scene.
Yeah, because I think that was what I was trying to get at just now, and what I wanted to ask you, because it felt like pre-internet, this almost felt like a forum or a bit like a Facebook page, a community where there was a reduction of the boundary between the artist and the fan, and it felt...
Absolutely. And we absolutely loved that. I mean, of course, every band loves their fans, but it was like so many of these kids would come, they would hitchhike for miles, hundreds of miles to come to the shows. I've recently reconnected with an old fan called Vicky, who used to sneak out, she was 14 at the time, sneak out of her house, get together with a couple of buddies at our show, and then we'd end up having to look after her. And on a couple of occasions, we'd call her mum and say, Vicky's okay. She's with, a naughty little punk rock band in Sheffield, but she's okay. Just brilliant. I loved the family atmosphere, and that was lovely. And so we wanted to continue, and a lot of these guys became our merch seller or our driver or a roadie, and certainly our first manager was a fan of the band. John Adkins was a fan of the band. He was an ENTS officer at what was then Lanchester Polytechnic, now Coventry University, and so he loved us, put us on as support to Death Cult. And so another example of a fan becoming a member of the team. Crucial. And fanzines were a big part of that, and everything took a long time. People would send us fan mail. We'd write back with a little gift inside, send it back. They'd send us a check for 20p to send us send them a copy of the fanzine. You just trust that they got it. But I can remember going down to the telephone box. I was before we had John, I was managing the band, and we didn't have a telephone in the house that we were all living in. So I would take a bag of change down the telephone box and take care of business by calling up record companies or promoters or whatever.
There's such passion in those pages as well, because I had a few copies, actually. I had a few fanzines. I had a Stab the Sun, which unfortunately I wish I'd held on to them more closely. I got them at collectors' fairs and off eBay and things like that. Sadly, no longer with me. We could talk about the wicked humour and all the rude stuff, but there was a real innocence to it too. And in a funny kind of way, I kind of see parallels even now with Google at the helm. I will always advocate for something like YouTube or Nebula if you want fewer restrictions, in terms of somebody having an idea in their room and having a go at something and doing something because they're passionate about it. And that's what zine culture feels like to me. And it's still out there, just in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It was great fun. And I can remember us sitting around in a circle, just, hate cutting and pasting and gluing and then photocopying, and somebody's girlfriend would sneak the zine in to be photocopied at her place of work and bring it back, and then just like, wow, stapling it together. It was just, we did all our own flyers. We did posters were quite small because we had limited money and access to big photocopiers, but nevertheless all that art was done by the band in a cut and paste fashion, which I love the idea of, because it also goes back to Bowie and William Burroughs in terms of cut and paste lyrics, which I've experimented with many times myself in terms of what else can I do with these words.
Well, that's a perfect way to wrap this up, because I thought as a fun final thing, a little aside, I could throw some song titles at you, album titles, record titles that you've written, and you could give me just a few words on the meaning behind it, if indeed there is any particular meaning. Because you've always had a certain proclivity for brilliant song titles. So, if you're up for it, let's start with my personal favourite. This is from 1984. If That's Your Bat, I'm Leaving Town. What can you tell me about that?
Okay, nothing to do with goth kind of bats. It's actually came out of us fly posting when we were trying to promote gigs. It was a bit of a dodgy affair because you had to dodge the cops, and also because if you fly posted over somebody else's poster, then that was a big no-no. And we inadvertently did that on a couple of occasions, and we got a friendly or not warning that if we did that again, please don't do that again, guys, but if we did do it again, you'll have somebody knocking on your door with a baseball bat. And it frightened the living daylights out of us, and so I actually came up with this lyric, which is, if that's your bat, I'm leaving town. That was it. Pretty simple.
Okay, so also from 1984, the title track to Solid Glass Spine.
Okay, yeah, so very much for somebody who's very, very confident. So a lot of the characters are me. So in that particular one, I'm a very confident character. I'm very sure of myself, and often tipping over into a little bit of ego taking over. But nevertheless, at the heart of it, I've got a solid glass spine that can be broken at any stage. So even though there might be quite a lot of front and quite a lot of, throwing out my chest, I'm quite vulnerable inside.
From the very beginning, I am a horse.
Okay, here I have to say it's actually an adaptation of a poem by Jean Arp, who was an experimental Dadaist artist. And so, you'd have to ask him. But the way I see it is a song or a poem about alienation and not fitting in with society, feeling very, very out on the fringes, which, when I read that, it kind of spoke to me because it was, continuing to feel like I'm always going to be on the outskirts of society and never quite 100% fit in, even to this day.
One last one then, Mark. What are the teachings of Webb? I'm dying to know.
Well, I think we're going to have to draw a veil over that because, if I was to divulge what the teachings of Webb are,
you have to kill me.
Then our mystique, our bubble, would be pierced, and everybody would be able to do what we do. So I'm sorry, Jonathan. I'm really sorry. I cannot divulge.
Do you know, I was really hoping you were going to say that, because what is life without mystery, and what is life without whimsy?
Absolutely.
So, to wrap this up, tell me about where people can find out what you're doing now. Keep up to date.
All over social media, including TikTok, all the usual platforms, and also via email. I mean, we haven't got an Ausgang email address. Maybe we should. But, in terms of accessibility, people can message. It will be me that's answering because I tend to take care of all of this. It will be me that's answering, and I will always tell people it's me who's answering a direct message. But you'll find us there, and of course you can see all the stuff that's available on Bandcamp. And it's social media where you'll find out where we're going to be playing.
You mentioned Bandcamp there because I tell you, the Ausgang Bandcamp page is catnip to a collector because you've got demos and unreleased tracks on there. You've got the This Is Our Downfall vinyl of the Kabuki stuff. There are hand-drawn prints on there, old merch sheets and things like that. Just really cool things on there. So get yourself to Bandcamp. And also, Mark, little gig in your Leeds, maybe?
It's not in the realms of impossibility because Leeds Bradford is where Songs of Praise are based. And they've done a lot of work up there. Yeah.
So I think we'll wrap this up there. Thank you so much, Mark. It's been a real pleasure. It's been really good fun. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, you too. You too. Really, a real pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Mark. I'll get this up as soon as I can. But take care, mate. Thank you.
Take care. Good evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye. Well, what a nice fella, eh? Every time I get to the end of one of these, I've done 3 of these now, right? I'm both humbled and fascinated by the fact that A, people are willing to give up their time so readily to talk to me, and B, that there is so much more to their stories than they've already been explored, you know? I think, however chaotic an artist can appear on the surface, it's the clarity of purpose behind it all that sustains it past the initial fizz of excitement, you know? New Musical Chairs is, as always, produced and presented by me, Jay Cridford. The opening monologue was taken from Ausgang's Solid Glass Spine, title track of the EP of the same name. The next episode will be with Simon Hugh Jones from And Also The Trees, top 5 band for me, so I am really excited and nervous about that. As always, thank you so much for listening, and share this, like this, spot the dog, pin the tail on the donkey, all that stuff. But we'll see you next time. Thank you.